The gavel was supposed to drop on a formality, a quiet transfer of power that had been orchestrated months in advance. In the polished, mahogany-paneled room, the auctioneer's rhythmic chant was nothing more than a mask for a pre-written ending. The bidders were mere props, and the crowd was blind to the invisible strings pulling their futures out from under them. But sitting in the back row, wearing grease-stained knuckles and a faded work shirt, was 71-year-old Elias. He wasn't there to bid. He was there because he had spent 40 years fixing what others deemed broken, and he knew exactly when a system was being dismantled on purpose. The auction house was a bastion of prestige, located in the heart of the city's historic district. It occupied a sprawling, neoclassical building where the floors were polished to a mirror sheen and the air smelled faintly of expensive floor wax and old money. For decades, it had been the primary conduit for the disposal of municipal assets, everything from industrial machinery to decommissioned public land. To the average citizen, the process was the epitome of civic transparency. Notices were posted in local gazettes, registered bidders were vetted, and the gavel fell where the highest offer landed. But Elias knew that machines, even bureaucratic ones, eventually developed cracks. The fix in question was not a crude affair, it was an exercise in sophisticated gaslighting. The target was a prime piece of riverfront property that had been reclaimed from a defunct manufacturing facility. The land was appraised at 10 times its eventual sale price. The strategy employed by the syndicate was to manipulate the pre-qualification phase. By introducing a series of Byzantine regulations regarding environmental liability, they successfully disqualified every reputable developer who lacked a specific, obscure certification, one that could only be obtained through a shell corporation they controlled. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic obstruction. When the day of the auction finally arrived, the room was filled with the usual suspects, local dignitaries, hedge fund managers in bespoke suits, and the occasional curious onlooker. The atmosphere was stiflingly formal. The auctioneer, a man named Sterling with a voice like polished gravel, navigated the process with practiced ease. He spoke of community development and urban renewal, his words weaving a narrative of progress that felt hollow to anyone paying close attention. Elias sat near the back, his calloused hands resting on his knees. He didn't look like he belonged in a room where a single handshake could involve millions of dollars. But Elias didn't view the world through financial metrics, he viewed it through systems of cause and effect. He had worked as a lead mechanic for the city's water department for 40 years. He knew the pressure points of every pipe and valve in the district. When you work with machines, you learn that if a gear isn't turning, there is a reason. If a system is vibrating in a way it shouldn't, there is a loose bolt somewhere. He watched the front row. There, the primary beneficiary of this rigged game, a developer named Marcus Thorne, sat with his legs crossed, checking his watch with a smug, rhythmic precision. Thorne wasn't even listening to the bidding increments, he was watching Sterling. The two men shared a glance, a fleeting, almost imperceptible micro-expression, every time a legitimate bidder attempted to raise their paddle. It was a silent conversation. Sterling would intentionally ignore the back of the room, turning his body toward the empty air or focusing on a predetermined signal from Thorne's camp, effectively silencing the competition. The corruption was systemic, yet it relied entirely on the arrogance of the perpetrators. They assumed that because everyone in the room was wealthy or powerful, they were all in on the joke. They operated under the assumption that the little people, who might care about the public nature of the land, were too busy working, too intimidated by the legal jargon, or too cynical to bother speaking up. They were counting on the silence of the crowd. Elias looked at the document he had pulled from the public archives weeks prior. It was a simple technical specification report, buried under 3 inches of paperwork, which contradicted every claim Thorne's company was making about the site's environmental unsuitability. He had spent 3 nights with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing the state's actual geological data with the falsified reports the city had authorized. The math didn't add up. The pressure on the valves was being intentionally kept low to drive down the value. He felt a deep, slow burn of anger in his chest. It wasn't the volatile, explosive anger of a younger man. It was the cold, steady fury of an engine that had been pushed past its limit. He had spent his life maintaining the infrastructure that kept this city running, the sewers, the pumps, the filtration systems. He had seen the way money flowed into the pockets of the few while the foundations of the public good were left to rust. The auction was just a microcosm of everything he had fought against for 4 decades. As the bidding reached the final stretch, the price was stalling at a fraction of the land's true value. Sterling was leaning forward, his gavel hovering over the podium, ready to finalize the theft. The room was deathly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Thorne was already preparing his exit, the ghost of a triumphant smile playing on his lips. Nobody was going to stop this. The institutions were the facilitators, the laws were the weapons. It was a closed loop, a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of extraction. Except for the mechanic in the back. Elias stood up, his joints popping audibly in the silence. He didn't raise his hand to bid. He raised his voice, and it cut through the room like a wrench hitting concrete. He didn't shout, he spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who held the schematics in his pocket. He asked one question, a question that demanded an answer the auctioneer could not give without indicting himself. The room froze. The mask had slipped, and for the first time in his life, the invisible mechanic was the one holding the power. Elias had been invisible his entire life, not by choice, but by the nature of his trade. When you are the one responsible for the city's heart, the massive, subterranean pump stations that moved millions of gallons of water daily, you become a phantom. People only notice you when something breaks. When the water flows clear, you are a ghost. When the pipes burst at 3 a.m. during a winter freeze, you are a savior. This duality had shaped his entire worldview. He knew how to read the hidden language of systems, interpreting the vibrations of a failing pump or the peculiar hum of a pressure valve that was being pushed beyond its safety rating. Growing up, he hadn't studied law or economics, he studied physics and leverage. He understood that every complex machine, no matter how vast, was beholden to the laws of mechanics. If you applied the right amount of force at the right fulcrum, even a massive engine would yield. This was the philosophy he brought to his life, a life marked by the quiet accumulation of knowledge. While others spent their evenings at social clubs or chasing promotions, Elias spent his time in the local archives and city libraries. He was a man who collected facts like other men collected coins. He found beauty in the mundane details of urban planning and zoning maps, finding the inconsistencies that everyone else glossed over. His decision to intervene wasn't a sudden burst of heroics. It was the inevitable result of a lifetime of observation. He had seen the slow decay of the city's infrastructure firsthand. He had witnessed budgets being slashed for essential repairs, only to see millions poured into vanity projects that served no one but the developers in the front row. He knew that if the public land was sold for a pittance, the city would never recover the value. It would be carved up, privatized, and turned into exclusive enclaves, effectively cutting off the public from their own heritage. He didn't need a lawyer to see the crime, he needed common sense. During his investigation, he had retraced the paper trail of the riverfront site. It was a tedious process, involving hours of thumbing through dusty ledgers and cross-referencing maps that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. He found the missing link in a footnote of an environmental survey from 1982, which clearly outlined the bedrock stability of the land, a fact that the current, fraudulent report claimed was unstable. It was a blatant lie, designed to scare off genuine bidders and suppress the market price. He worked in solitude, his kitchen table covered in blueprints and annotated documents. He wasn't acting out of malice or greed, he was acting out of a deep, abiding respect for the truth. He felt that the city was like an old, complex engine that had been neglected for too long. The people in power were like amateur mechanics who were tightening bolts that should be loose and ignoring the leaks that were flooding the engine block. They were destroying the very thing that sustained them. The process of gathering evidence required a level of meticulousness that would have frustrated most people. He had to navigate through the labyrinth of municipal record-keeping, dealing with dismissive clerks and hidden digital archives. He developed a routine: arrive at the municipal building as it opened, request the files, spend hours transcribing, and return home to analyze. He became a fixture in the records office, a quiet man with a weathered notebook. People assumed he was looking into a property dispute or a simple tax inquiry. They never suspected he was mapping the anatomy of a systemic, multi-million-dollar theft. His approach to the problem was purely technical. He didn't think in terms of grand moral victories, he thought in terms of troubleshooting. He viewed the auction as a malfunctioning system that needed to be recalibrated. If the evidence was presented correctly, the system would have to correct itself. It was as simple as that, or so he told himself. He wasn't looking to become a martyr, he was looking to prevent a catastrophe. The corruption was the friction in the machine, the grinding gears that would eventually cause the whole thing to seize up. He felt the weight of his years, the stiffness in his back, the ache in his knees. He was 71, and he knew his time was finite. But he also knew that he had a responsibility to leave the machine in better shape than he found it. This wasn't about the land, it was about the precedent. If they could get away with stealing this, what would they steal next? The parks. The schools. The very streets they walked on. He refused to let that happen on his watch. When he finally walked into the auction house on that fateful morning, he didn't look like a threat. He was just another old man in a worn jacket. But under his arm, he carried a folder that contained the truth. It was a simple, elegant solution to a complex problem. He had spent years learning how to listen to the city, and today, he was going to make sure the city listened to him. The auction was the perfect place for a confrontation. It was where the corruption was most visible, where the greed was most concentrated. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to be a ghost. He was going to be the wrench that stopped the machine in its tracks. The tension in the air was palpable, yet it existed only within the confines of Elias's own perception. To the rest of the world, it was simply a Tuesday in the city, business as usual, wheels turning, money changing hands. But to Elias, the auction house felt like a pressurized boiler nearing a critical failure point. He sat in the back row, blending into the shadows of the wood-paneled walls, his eyes darting between the auctioneer's rhythmic gestures and the calculated glances of the conspirators. Every fiber of his being was calibrated to notice the anomalies, the slight deviations in the standard operating procedure that signaled the fix was fully engaged. The gathering storm wasn't a sudden event, it was a slow, agonizing accumulation of proof. In the weeks leading up to the auction, Elias had performed a series of stress tests on the system. He had filed anonymous inquiries, posing as a curious investor, asking pointed questions about the environmental remediation requirements of the property. The responses he received were scripted, rehearsed, and evasive. He recorded every interaction, noting the names, the dates, and the specific departments that stonewalled him. He was methodically mapping the circuit board of the corruption, identifying which nodes were controlled by Thorne and which were merely complicit through negligence. Contrast framing was his greatest weapon. He would hold up the official, falsified appraisal next to the genuine geological surveys he had unearthed from the state archives. The disparity was not just a rounding error, it was a deliberate, massive devaluation of public assets. Seeing the two documents side by side was like looking at two different worlds. One was a sanitized, curated reality designed to facilitate a theft, the other was the raw, unvarnished truth of the land's worth. Elias understood that the power of his evidence relied on its simplicity. It didn't require an advanced degree to see that a lie was being told. It just required the courage to point it out. The conspirators, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant of the storm gathering behind them. Marcus Thorne, the wealthy developer, continued his performance of arrogance, occasionally laughing with his associates in a display of practiced ease. They were so consumed by their own importance that they didn't even notice the elderly man in the back row. They were looking for threats from the usual places, other developers, city council members, investigative journalists, not a retired mechanic who spent his days looking at blueprints. This was their critical oversight, the loose bolt that would eventually cause their entire structure to collapse. Elias began his preparations for the confrontation. He didn't have a PR team, a legal department, or a platform, but he had something more dangerous, a clear, unwavering objective. He spent his nights refining his script, condensing hours of research into a few, razor-sharp sentences that would shatter the illusion of legitimacy the auction house had carefully constructed. He knew that if he spoke too soon, they would dismiss him as a crank. If he spoke too late, the property would be sold, and the paperwork would be finalized. Timing was the key to any successful mechanical repair, and he was waiting for the exact moment when the system was most vulnerable. He watched the bidders, the way their hesitation was being manipulated. Whenever a legitimate buyer showed interest, Sterling would artificially speed up the auction, using rapid-fire increments to discourage them. It was a classic, forced-pace tactic. Elias counted the seconds between each bid. He observed the subtle nods and winks passing between the auctioneer and Thorne's group. It was a well-oiled machine, operating with the precision of a clock, but it was a clock that was keeping the wrong time. He felt a surge of adrenaline, not of fear, but of anticipation. He had spent decades repairing the city's failures, and today, he was going to expose the architects of that decay. The room was getting warmer, the tension thick enough to cut with a blade. Elias adjusted his grip on the folder, his knuckles white. He reminded himself that he wasn't doing this for himself, he was doing it for the city, for the people who worked hard and played by the rules, and for the principle that the public trust was not a commodity to be auctioned off to the highest briber. The arrogance of the room was intoxicating, a bubble of privilege that was about to be punctured. He felt like a surge of high-pressure water finally finding its way through a blocked pipe. The flow was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. He checked his pocket watch. It was nearing the final call. The auctioneer began his closing chant, his voice rising in volume, the gavel trembling in his hand. The room held its breath, waiting for the final, preordained conclusion. Thorne leaned forward, his face a mask of predatory triumph. This was the moment of maximum risk, the point of no return. Elias stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo for an eternity. The storm had finally arrived, and the silence of the room was about to be broken in a way no one would ever forget. The sound of the chair scraping against the hardwood floor was like a gunshot in a library. Every head in the room swiveled toward the back, where Elias stood, a silhouette of frayed denim and stubborn resolve against the polished gold leaf of the auction house walls. The air, previously thick with the rhythmic, hypnotic chant of the auctioneer, suddenly turned frigid. Sterling, the auctioneer, froze mid-syllable, his gavel hanging in the air like a poised weapon. For 5 seconds, there was absolute, ringing silence. It was the sound of a system that had been forced to stop because it had hit an obstruction it couldn't account for. "I have a question regarding the valuation of this lot," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonant, gravelly quality of a man used to projecting instructions over the roar of industrial pumps. It was a sound that commanded attention, not through volume, but through the weight of unvarnished truth. Marcus Thorne, sitting in the front row, didn't turn around immediately. He let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that was meant to signal to his entourage that this was merely a nuisance, a senile disruption to be swatted away. "We aren't taking questions, friend," Thorne called out over his shoulder, his voice dripping with condescension. "The bidding is closed. Please sit down or be escorted out." Elias didn't sit. He began to walk down the aisle, his pace deliberate and heavy. In his hand, he held the folder of documents. "The bidding is based on a fraud," Elias stated, his tone flat and clinical, as if he were diagnosing a faulty pressure gauge. "This property is listed as having a Level 4 environmental hazard in the auction prospectus. That is a lie. I have the state's seismic and geological survey here, dated 6 months ago. The land is stable. It is prime industrial real estate, not a toxic liability. You are suppressing the price to steal a public asset for pennies on the dollar." The room erupted into a murmuring hum. Some of the bidders, who had been intimidated by the complex regulations cited by the auction house, turned to look at each other with newfound suspicion. Sterling's face had drained of color, his practiced mask of jovial authority fraying at the edges. "This is trespassing," Sterling shouted, gesturing for the security staff who stood by the exits. "Remove this man at once. He is disrupting a legal proceeding." "Is it a legal proceeding?" Elias countered, stopping just 10 feet from the podium. He placed the folder on an empty chair near the front. "Or is it a crime in progress? I've spent 40 years working for this city, keeping the water running when the pipes were bursting. I know how to read a report, and I know how to spot a leak. This whole auction is leaking corruption, and the stench is becoming impossible to ignore. Two security guards began to move down the aisle, but they hesitated. Elias wasn't acting like a protester, he was acting like an auditor. There was something about his demeanor, the complete lack of fear, the cold clarity of his eyes, that made the security guards wonder if they were the ones on the wrong side of the law. They slowed their approach, their eyes darting to Thorne for instructions. Thorne was now standing, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and terror. He knew that if this information reached the press, the entire deal, and perhaps his own career, would be incinerated. "He's a crackpot," Thorne hissed, his voice rising in panic. "Don't listen to a word of this. It's a smear campaign funded by our competitors. If it's a lie, prove me wrong," Elias replied, stepping toward the stage. He opened the folder, revealing the documents to the crowd. He didn't wave them around, he laid them out on the table near the podium like a technician showing a client the broken part. The contrast was undeniable, the official, slickly designed auction pamphlet, and the raw, stamped state records. The visual juxtaposition was so jarring that even the most casual observer could see the disparity. The official narrative was clearly a fabrication. The tension reached a breaking point. Several bidders began to stand, moving toward the front to get a better look at the documents. The spell of the auction was broken. The rhythmic chant was replaced by the chaotic energy of a mob that had just realized it was being cheated. Sterling looked at the guards, then at Thorne. His eyes wide with the realization that he couldn't shout this away. The mechanic had bypassed the gatekeepers, ignored the bureaucracy, and gone straight to the source of the truth. The auction was dead. By the end of the week, the auction house was under federal investigation. Thorne's development company saw its stock plummet as the environmental hazard lie was exposed as a coordinated effort to defraud both the city and the public. The riverfront property was pulled from the auction block and a new, transparent bidding process was implemented, one that actually allowed for public oversight. The ripple effect of Elias's intervention was profound. It wasn't just about one plot of land, it was about the realization that the invisible citizens of the city were not as powerless as the elites assumed. The mechanics' protest, as it was dubbed in the local papers, became a rallying cry for community groups. People who had been intimidated by the complex jargon and the impenetrable walls of municipal government began to realize that if an elderly man in a work shirt could dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud, then they, too, had the capacity to hold power to account. Elias returned to his life of quiet observation, but he was no longer truly invisible. He became a symbol, a reminder that integrity is not a trait reserved for those in high office, but a function of one's willingness to stand up when the system begins to fail. He continued to work on his projects, to maintain his home, and to walk the streets of the city he had helped preserve. He didn't seek fame or fortune, and he turned down every request for a public speech or a political endorsement. He remained, as he always had been, a man who believed in the inherent value of fixing what was broken. The legacy of the auction house incident wasn't found in a statue or a plaque. It was found in the changed culture of the city's administrative offices. Clerks were more careful, records were made more accessible, and the arrogance that had once defined the dealings of the elite was replaced by a newfound caution. They knew that somewhere, in the back of the room, there might be another mechanic, another observer, another person who knew how to read the schematics and was not afraid to speak up when they saw a leak. Ultimately, the story of the 71-year-old mechanic was a testament to the power of a single, informed individual to alter the course of events. He proved that you don't need a massive platform or a high-ranking title to challenge corruption, you only need the courage to see the truth and the resolve to step forward. The machine of the city was, and would always be, a complex, flawed, and often broken system, but because of Elias, it was a system that was slightly less susceptible to the rot of greed. He had performed the ultimate service, he had forced a system to work for the people it was built to serve, rather than the ones who were trying to strip it for parts. As the sun set over the riverfront, the same land he had saved, Elias sat on his porch, the quiet hum of the city in the distance, his hands still bearing the calluses of a lifetime of labor. He knew that the fight against corruption was a never-ending cycle, a perpetual maintenance project that would always require someone to pay attention to the details. But for tonight, the pressure valves were holding steady, the gears were turning smoothly, and for the first time in a long time, the city felt like it was finally in the hands of someone who actually knew how to take care of it. The gavel had fallen, but this time, it was the sound of justice, not a pre-written ending, echoing through the city streets.